The morning had not fully decided what it was going to be. The parking lot was quiet, washed in a pale gray light, when I noticed a familiar car sitting alone near the edge. Condensation fogged the windows, softening the shapes inside. At first, I looked away. It felt wrong to stare. Then I saw the small sneaker pressed against the glass, and my breath caught. In the back seat, 2 children slept under thin blankets, their faces slack with a tiredness no child should carry. I stood there longer than I should have. When I finally stepped closer, recognition came slowly, like a bruise blooming. It was my son's car. My son. The realization settled heavy in my chest, bringing disbelief first, then shame. I had assumed distance meant independence. I had told myself he was fine. He stirred in the front seat when I tapped the window, blinking as if waking from something deeper than sleep. In that moment, fear rushed in behind the guilt. Fear of how long this had been happening. Fear of what I had missed. I kept my voice steady, because that is what parents do when they are breaking. How long had my son been living like this while I assumed he was fine? The question echoed, unanswered, as I watched him smooth the blanket over his boys. Standing there, I felt the present slip, pulling me backward into memory, searching for the moment I should have seen the truth and asked why. I raised my son to believe that work was a kind of promise you made to yourself. He learned early that showing up mattered, even when no one was watching. As a boy, he stacked firewood without being asked, finished chores before play, and carried a quiet pride that never needed applause. He did not complain. He did not ask for help unless there was no other choice. When he became a man, that pride settled deeper, turning into a belief that needing others was a kind of failure he should spare them from. When he married, I thought he had chosen well. His wife seemed to bring order where he brought effort. She was charming in a measured way, always prepared, always pleasant. Birthdays were remembered, schedules were color-coded, and thank-you notes arrived exactly when they should. She spoke of partnership and sacrifice, and I believed her because it fit the picture she presented. From the outside, they looked balanced, modern, capable. I mistook appearance for truth. The distance between my son and me did not arrive suddenly. It came in small, reasonable pieces. A missed call returned days later. A holiday shortened because of work. Conversations that stayed polite but shallow, as if deeper things had been packed away for later. I told myself this was adulthood. I told myself I had raised him to stand on his own, and now he was doing exactly that. Respecting his space felt like love. Looking back, I see how often I chose comfort over curiosity. I accepted excuses because they made life simpler. I believed silence meant stability. When my son said he was tired, I assumed it was ordinary fatigue. When he said everything was handled, I trusted him, because trusting him meant I did not have to ask difficult questions. My respect for boundaries slowly became an absence, and I did not recognize it as such. In our family, dignity was never loud. We valued self-reliance, steady effort, and enduring without spectacle. Problems were handled quietly, behind closed doors, and shared only when they were already solved. I passed those values on with pride, never imagining they could become a shield behind which someone suffered alone. I taught my son to be strong, but I never taught him how to ask. I remembered moments I had dismissed without thought, the way his voice tightened when money came up, how quickly he changed subjects when I mentioned visiting, the careful way he praised his wife without warmth. I had mistaken restraint for contentment. I had confused endurance with safety. Each memory returned now with sharper edges, forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. The past I leaned on for reassurance was no longer gentle, it accused me of not looking closely enough when it mattered most. As I stood there, listening to the hum of passing cars, the story I had told myself about our family cracked open. Pride had kept us upright, but it had also kept us apart. The values I cherished were not wrong, but they were incomplete. And in that unfinished space, my son had learned to disappear quietly, believing that was strength. That realization followed me back to the car, heavier than any memory I had carried before that morning. I knocked softly on the glass, careful not to wake the boys. My son rolled down the window a few inches, his eyes already apologetic, already prepared to explain. He smiled like nothing was wrong, like this was temporary, like I had misunderstood what I was seeing. "We're fine," he said quickly. "Just between places. It's only for a little while." He spoke the way he always had, smoothing sharp edges before anyone else could feel them. Up close, the truth resisted his words. His face looked thinner, the angles sharper than I remembered. There was a grayness beneath his skin that sleep alone could not explain. When he stepped out of the car, he moved carefully, as if energy were something to be rationed. The boys woke without fuss, stretching quietly, their manners too practiced for children their age. One of them asked if it was time for school, already buckling his backpack. No complaints. No questions. Just acceptance. I asked where they had been staying. He hesitated, then shrugged, pretending it didn't matter. He said they'd been managing, that it wasn't as bad as it looked. He joked about adventure, about stories they would laugh at later. I listened, nodding, while something inside me tightened. Hunger has a sound, and I heard it in the way he spoke too quickly, in the way the boys watched his face before speaking. When I asked about his wife, he paused longer. "We're separated," he said finally, staring me toward the road. He made it sound mutual, clean, sensible. He did not use her name. He did not explain how it happened or why the children were here with him. He said only that things had changed and that he didn't want trouble. There was no anger in his voice, only caution, as if blame itself were dangerous. I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but I held back. He had always hated scenes, always believed dignity meant containment. So I followed his lead, asking small questions, receiving careful replies. Yet every answer felt trimmed, edited to protect something fragile. Shame hung between us, heavier than anger. I realized he was guarding more than his pride, he was guarding a story he was not ready to tell. I knew then that what he wasn't saying mattered more than what he was. The silence had shape and weight. It filled the spaces between his words, settling into my chest with certainty. Whatever had brought him here was not an accident or a simple disagreement. It was something he had endured quietly, believing that bearing it alone was the right thing to do. I looked at my grandsons again, their feet dangling from the bumper, their voices low and patient. Childhood should not require that kind of composure. In that moment, restraint stopped feeling like respect and started feeling like neglect. I heard my own voice change as I told him they were coming home with me. I did not ask. I stated it, calmly and firmly. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it, relief flickering across his face before he could hide it. He finally nodded, as if conceding to something he had been carrying alone for too long. We packed the car in silence, the boys helping without being asked, each movement careful and rehearsed. I felt anger rising, but I kept it contained, knowing this moment was not for confrontation or judgment. It was for safety. As we drove away, I watched my son's reflection in the mirror, his shoulders lowering with every mile. Whatever had happened. Between him and his wife was still sealed behind his restraint, but I understood now that waiting for him to speak was no longer kindness. Silence had protected the wrong things. By the time we turned onto my street, I had made a decision that settled deep and steady inside me. I would listen without interruption. I would ask the questions he had been afraid to answer. And I would not allow dignity to be used as a reason for suffering ever again. That promise felt heavier than fear, and stronger than the habits I had learned over years. The truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced slowly, in pieces, over cups of reheated coffee and long pauses where my son searched for the right words. He spoke carefully, as if afraid that saying too much would collapse something fragile. The bank account had been drained in stages, he explained, small withdrawals at first, then larger ones justified as bills or investments. By the time he noticed, there was nothing left to question. The lease on their apartment had been ended without discussion, paperwork signed while he was working double shifts. Access to shared accounts, insurance, even basic passwords had disappeared quietly, cleanly, without argument or explanation. He did not call it betrayal. He described it as miscommunication, as growing apart, as adults making difficult choices. He said she encouraged independence, insisted he learn to manage on his own. When money ran out, she framed it as responsibility. When he asked about the children, she said they were better off with routine, with stability she could provide. Stability, it turned out, did not include him. The words emotional abuse never crossed his lips, but I heard them clearly in the spaces he left open. He told me he chose the car deliberately. Staying close to the boys' school mattered more than comfort. He did not want them waking up in unfamiliar places or explaining themselves to strangers. The car meant they could keep their routine, eat breakfast bars on the way, arrive quietly like everyone else. He slept sitting up so they could stretch out. He washed up in public restrooms and timed laundry between work shifts. He called it temporary, as if naming it otherwise would make it permanent. Inside my house, the evidence of that endurance appeared everywhere. His suits hung pressed and untouched, sleeves folded with care, reminders of interviews he never attended because he could not afford the fees. The boys' toys were lined neatly along the wall, cleaned and organized, protected from damage as if order could replace security. On the kitchen counter sat a small stack of unopened envelopes, legal letters he had not yet found the courage to read. He said he was waiting for the right moment, when things were calmer. I wondered how calm he thought life needed to be before truth was allowed. My anger grew with every detail, but it did not explode. It settled instead, heavy and focused. I was angry at her, at the careful cruelty of control disguised as encouragement. I was angry at myself for mistaking distance for health. But more than anything, I was angry at the way my son blamed himself for trusting someone who dismantled his life quietly. He spoke as if endurance were proof of failure, as if surviving this was something he had done wrong. I listened without interrupting, because this was not the time to assign guilt aloud. Confrontation would have closed him back up. Resolve, I learned, could be quieter than rage. I asked questions when he paused, practical ones about timelines and documents. I made notes without explaining why. I cooked meals that stayed on the stove long enough to fill the house with warmth. Each small act was a way of saying that this story would not be rushed or buried again. Late one afternoon, while folding laundry, a folded piece of paper slipped from his jacket pocket. It was creased and worn, handled often but never finished. He watched me pick it up, tension tightening his shoulders. It was a notice he had overlooked, something he thought was unimportant. I knew then that this single page, ignored out of exhaustion and fear, was not just paperwork. It was a beginning. It was the thread that would finally unravel what had been hidden too carefully for too long. That night, as the house settled, I sat awake thinking about how easily control can wear the mask of care. How often strength is demanded instead of offered. I understood then that this was not just my son's story, but a lesson in how silence can be shaped into a weapon when kindness is withheld intentionally, and how families notice only after damage is done. The document I found that afternoon refused to leave my thoughts. By morning, it was clear that quiet endurance was no longer enough. Truth needed light, not patience. What followed was not a dramatic explosion but a careful assembling of facts, each one confirming what my son had been too ashamed to name. Bank statements showed withdrawals timed precisely after his paychecks cleared. Emails revealed accounts created without his knowledge. There were messages, brief and clinical, that pointed to another relationship already underway while she spoke of rebuilding trust. The abandonment was not sudden, it had been planned, staged, and executed with calm precision. Publicly, she remained composed. Friends described her as responsible, organized, resilient. She spoke of independence and boundaries, of choosing peace over conflict. In private, her actions told a different story. She had controlled access, restricted information, and rewritten events to make herself appear generous while leaving my son stranded. It was not cruelty born of anger. It was calculation dressed as reason. We chose not to confront her impulsively. Instead, we requested mediation under the guise of finalizing arrangements. The meeting took place in a small conference room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. She arrived confident, prepared, carrying a folder thicker than ours. My son sat quietly beside me, shoulders tense but steady. The boys stayed home, but their presence weighed on every decision we made. When the discussion began, she spoke smoothly, narrating a version of events where separation was mutual and support had been offered. My son listened without interrupting, his hands folded in his lap. When it was his turn, he did not raise his voice. He placed documents on the table, one by one. Statements. Notices. Messages. Each page shifted the room slightly, like furniture being rearranged without asking. The mediator read carefully. Silence grew heavy. She attempted to explain, then to minimize. Independence, she said again. Boundaries. Necessary choices. But the evidence did not argue back. It simply existed. With every document, her control over the story weakened. My son spoke then, not to accuse, but to clarify. He described choosing the car so his children could stay in their school. He explained the exhaustion, the fear, the decisions made without alternatives. His voice did not shake. He did not insult her. He reclaimed the truth by naming it calmly. The power shift was unmistakable. She stopped speaking in paragraphs and began answering in fragments. The mediator asked direct questions. The room no longer belonged to her narrative. My son straightened, not in defiance, but in relief. He was no longer carrying the burden of proving he had tried hard enough. Later, when arrangements were finalized, the boys were told only what they needed to know. They watched their father that evening as he cooked. Dinner, steady and present. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors. They saw strength without spectacle. That mattered more than any outcome on paper. As I watched them sit together, laughter cautious but real, I understood that justice did not need to be loud to be complete. The truth had surfaced without cruelty. With everything exposed, we faced the harder question of what justice should look like now, knowing that dignity, once restored, needed careful protection. Relief arrived first, sudden and disorienting, like stepping into warm air after a long winter. It did not erase the grief, it made room for it. My son slept through the night for the first time in weeks, his breathing deep and unguarded. In the morning, he lingered over coffee as if time itself had slowed. The boys laughed more easily, their shoulders lighter, though questions still hovered in their eyes. Safety had returned, but the cost of losing it was still being counted. We moved carefully into the practical work of repair. Temporary housing became permanent within weeks, modest but stable, close enough to the school that routines did not fracture again. Legal protections were put in place quietly, without spectacle. Accounts were secured, schedules clarified, responsibilities defined. Each step restored something that had been taken, not just materially but emotionally. Predictability became a gift none of us took for granted. My son carried guilt through all of it. He spoke of the months he stayed silent, of the help he did not ask for, of the nights his children slept in a car because he believed endurance was expected of him. I listened, resisting the instinct to dismiss his regret too quickly. Pain deserved acknowledgement. I told him he had survived something designed to make him doubt himself, and survival does not look clean or brave from the inside. Responsibility, I reminded him, did not belong to the one who was dismantled piece by piece. His wife receded from the center of our lives without drama. There was no campaign against her, no retelling of her actions to anyone who would listen. What mattered was that the truth was known where it needed to be known. Exposure was consequence enough. She became a fact rather than a force, and that shift brought an unexpected calm. Energy once spent reacting could now be used to rebuild. The boys adjusted in small, telling ways. They left toys scattered without apology. They argued over cereal. They slept sprawled across their beds, unafraid of being asked to move. These ordinary disruptions felt like victories. My son watched them with a quiet intensity, as if memorizing proof that protection had worked. I found myself changing too. I checked in more often, asked questions sooner, stayed when I might once have given space. Love, I learned, is not only trust but attention, not only respect but presence. I understood then that justice had arrived not as punishment, but as shelter. It looked like consistency, like doors that locked, like mornings that did not begin in fear. It looked like a father who could finally exhale. Time began to pass again, not rushing, not erasing, but settling gently over what had been broken. The wounds did not disappear. They closed slowly, forming scars that would remind us to notice sooner, speak sooner, and never mistake silence for strength again. Those lessons stayed with me, shaping every choice I made afterward, quietly and permanently from then. Months passed, and life settled into a shape that was smaller than before but far more honest. My son's new home was modest, nothing that would impress anyone, but it held what mattered. The kitchen smelled of simple meals cooked slowly. We ate together most evenings, plates crowded, conversations overlapping. Laughter returned in pieces at first, cautious and uncertain, then fuller as the boys grew confident that it would not be taken away. Routine became a kindness rather than a trap. I watched my son relearn himself in that space. He woke earlier, not from fear, but habit. He began fixing small things around the house, anchoring himself through usefulness rather than survival. I noticed how often he looked at his children, really looked, as if checking that they were still there. Those moments reminded me how easily suffering can hide behind competence, how pride can disguise exhaustion. I carried my share of regret, knowing there were signs I chose not to read. This time, I promised myself, distance would never replace attention again. Forgiveness entered our lives carefully. It was not demanded or rushed. We spoke of it as a choice, one that belonged only to those who had been hurt. Some things could be released, others would simply be understood and set down quietly. Forgiveness, I learned, does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means refusing to let bitterness dictate the future. It means telling the truth and then stepping forward without dragging the weight of it behind you. As the seasons changed, peace stopped feeling fragile. The boys grew louder, messier, more certain. My son grew steadier, his voice less guarded, his laughter easier to reach. The betrayal that once defined everything became a chapter rather than the whole story. Dignity had survived not because the harm was small, but because truth had been met with courage and love, and because someone had finally said enough. Looking back, I understand strength differently now. I once believed it meant enduring quietly, handling everything alone, asking nothing of anyone. Now I know strength lives in noticing, in staying, in refusing to let the people you love disappear behind silence. I once thought being strong meant standing alone. Now I know it means never letting your children suffer in silence. That lesson is the inheritance I intend to pass on, carried forward through presence, honesty, and unyielding care always onward.